Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of The Thoughtful Bro, here with Peter Ho Davies. I am so excited for today's show. A few words before we get started. Today, we are live streaming, as always, on Tuesday at 2 o'clock on the Facebook and YouTube channels of A Mighty Blaze. We are here always to talk about what makes great books tick and what makes great authors tick. Today, we get to go sort of into the engine room of the artist process in the kind of least talked about but most important area of the writing process in some way, which is the revision process. And Peter is just absolutely eloquent on this topic, as he is on all things. But a little bit more about the Blaze before we get going. Mighty Blaze is an all-volunteer initiative to help writers reach readers during COVID and beyond. You can find all of our interviews in our libraries on Facebook or on YouTube. At A Mighty Blaze, we're not asking for money. You can support us just by liking us and following us on social media. If you're new, just give us a like or a follow on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or Twitter. If you want to find out more about A Mighty Blaze or get a schedule of our weekly upcoming author interviews, you can just put in your email to @amightyblaze.com and you'll get our newsletter every Sunday. If there's another way you'd like to interact with A Mighty Blaze, we also have a podcast, which is now entering its third season. This week's episode is Ruth Ware, I believe, and I think next week we're going to have Zibby Owens. Zibby Owens just launched her own publishing imprint. So that's an exciting person for us to talk to you about all of that. That's on our podcast. Again, all of this is completely and utterly free. But if you are, in fact, in the mood to spend some money, I'm going to tell you how to do it. You're going to buy one of two fabulous books. The first is A Lie Someone Told You About Yourself by Peter Ho Davies, which was Peter's novel that came out earlier this year. And more importantly, this is a yes and, The Art of Revision, The Last Word. This is the book that we're mainly going to be talking about today. It's a deep dive again on revision. So please just go ahead, open a new tab. It's basically Christmas season. And by the way, these will fit in a stocking. You can put both of these in one stocking. So if you know a writer, help them out and buy them these books. So a few more things before I introduce Peter. Next week on the show, I'm going to have on the fantabulous Jenna Blum, who of course is the New York Times bestselling author and the co-founder of Mighty Blaze. Jenna has a memoir coming out called Woodrow on the Bench, which is about her late dog Woodrow. It's sort of like Tuesdays with Maury, but for dog lovers. It's a very kind of poignant, heartwarming book about the last year of a dog's life. But on to our guest today. So Peter Ho Davies is the author of 3 novels, including A Lie Someone Told You About Yourself, which was out in January, and 2 story collections. He is the winner of the Anisfield Wolf Award and the Penn Malamud Prize, and he teaches at the University of Michigan. He lives in Ann Arbor. In The Art of Revision, The Last Word, Davies takes up the sometimes mysterious, often dreaded, yet all-important topic for writers, revision. He uses his own work as examples, as well as the work of such writers as Hemingway, Flannery O'Connor, and Raymond Carver, and he discusses why and how writers should revise. Earlier this year, I had George Saunders on the show, and I asked him, what are the qualities that most determine whether a writer will succeed or not? And he said there's 2. The first is an attention to causality in a story, and the second was a willingness to revise. So to discuss everything you ever wanted to know but were afraid to ask about revision, Peter Ho Davies, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Mark. It's great to be here. I feel a little guilty, right, because you're plugging those 2 books, and it's 2 books in a year, kind of unheard of for me, but they do make good stocking stuffers because they're so skinny. So I feel like if I'm making other writers feel intimidated right now because I wrote 2 in a year, they're both very short. They're basically one book, one regular length book, but in 2 different volumes.
Well, I mean, Peter, that was like actually one of my first questions is I wanted to talk about, several people when they were reviewing, you got great reviews for A Lie Someone Told You About Yourself. And this book actually comes out on November 2nd. And for scheduling reasons, we had to have Peter on early, but please go ahead and order the book. You can just pre-order it and you'll get it in a couple weeks. But, in the reviews of both these books, certainly this one and then this one to the extent there are reviews, the phrase that often comes up is a slim gem of a book. This is the slim gem market.
It's something very rarely said about me, myself, in person, I have to say. So maybe that's what I'm channeling. That's how you know it's fiction sometimes.
Oh my God. So But really, I want to talk about this for a moment because, like, by the way, Jenna is coming on next week, and Jenna's book is the same size. It's this slim gem kind of holiday book. What is a publisher trying to communicate to the reader when they publish a slim gem? Is there like a thing they're trying to kind of say without saying?
Oh, it's funny. I'm not sure what the publishers are necessarily trying to do, although I do like that format, right? I like the size and the scale of it, I think, in various ways. Maybe what they're trying to say, and maybe what the writer is trying to say is, this is not going to take you the entire fall to read, right? It's funny. I teach a little bit when I talk to my undergrads about contemporary novels, and it feels as though there are and have been over the last decade or so, a couple of movements, right? So on the one hand, we get a number of books that go quite a bit shorter, right? I'm just teaching Justin Torres's We the Animals now, which is a great example of that. I'll do Sigrid Nunez as the Friend later in the semester, which is also sort of in that space. But it also feels as though maybe a few years ago, although I think the new Anthony Doerr book probably leans into this space as well, and maybe the new Jonathan Franzen as well, where you've got books that seem to go even longer, right? Up into the 5, the 6 or 7 or 800 page length. And I think the theory with those long books was that they were sort of double downing on a novelistic immersion, right? And I think that's probably true. I think it's a great strategy. It's a way of distinguishing the novel from TV or movies, maybe our other sort of narrative entertainments. But I think as a writer, mostly of short books, I have a slight, and I should say I'm an admirer of Anthony Doerr's, a slight resentment for those huge books, because it feels as though most readers have the bandwidth for one of those 800-page books, and that bandwidth might take up the space of two or three other 300-page books in a certain sense. So it feels like there's a kind of land grab for attention going on with those big books sometimes.
But I also think that those long books, for me, this is just purely my own point of view. It just takes a certain amount of buildup. I'm like, oh, here we go. I'm gonna read Anthony Doerr's latest, But I mean, with a slim gem like this, I feel like, you know what? Even if I'm not saying this about you particularly, but if I see that page count, like 171 pages, I'm like, why not? I mean, it's so easy to make an impulse buy because it's just 3 or 4 hours really to read a book like that.
And I think, one of the reasons I wanted to write one of that length is because I'm, for that very same reason, drawn to those books in the bookstore. And I think for me, it's situational. It's often that feeling of it's hard to find time in the middle of a busy semester, or hard to find time in the middle of busy parenting. And I know you've got a number of kids, right? And just to fit in a big doorstop of a book like that can sometimes be a little challenging. I mean, when I have the time, I love them. But to do it in the middle sometimes of a busy period of life, those shorter books feel much more accessible. And then I feel like I have that little bit of that satisfaction of, look, there's a pile of books I've read this semester, but they're all only 150 to 200 pages long. But, it's still a number of books, which is nice.
Right. Okay, well, so let's dig into this. So this is this book, which is the main book we're going to be talking about today, The Art of Revision. This is it's from Grey Wolf Press. It is the 15th book in that series. They do a series called The Art of, and they have a lot of terrific writers talking about the art of perspective, the art of language, the art of this and that. But I just think The Art of Revision, as I said in my opening, it is in many ways the most vast and the most critical of all these things. I mean, you at one point say in the book, which I think is right to say, that even when you write your first draft, you're already revising, because you're revising sort of the image that you have in your head, or the notion that you have in the head of your head in the story. And I just think, revision is just the place where most books, frankly, just go off the rails, and most writers kind of are least able to do it. So, I mean, do you agree that revision is sort of this like secret, massive topic?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I talk a fair bit, I think, in the book by way of preamble about sort of the invisibility of revision, right? In a certain sense, I think most of us as writers learn a lot of our skills from reading other writers, right? So I might learn, how somebody does great dialogue there, how somebody sets a wonderful scene there. And, we teach into this space. Most of us teach ourselves in those particular fashions. And yet the thing about revision, which does feel really central as a skill to all of our work, is that it's a little invisible to us, right? We typically only see the final draft of a work. And so I actually spend a certain amount of time in the book and indeed in classes that I teach, trying to sort of point towards not just literary examples of revision, but to suggest that it's all around us in the world, that in a certain sense, adaptations of books into film or reboots, sequels, retcons, even, all of those have a kind of version of revision going on, even if it's revision by another hand. And hopefully, in a sense, it demystifies the revision process just a little bit as well, and also allows us to see into other people's, I think, in certain ways too. But the idea that it's it's everywhere and that it's fundamental to writing. That feels encoded in, a phrase that a lot of people use, the idea that all writing is revision, which can feel a little stern. It feels like we're also saying to all writers, oh, you have to go and revise now. But I think for me, and I think you're touching on it there, anytime I write something from life, anytime I write something from memory, anytime I write something from research, once it ends up on the page, it is being changed from what I recall, what I remember, what I researched, what I lived through. So it's already being revised.
Right.
The joke I sometimes make is a sense that I think all of us actually share, that feeling that we've all had probably back in grade school or middle school, where somebody's cracked wise at our expense in the playground, and we don't have that snappy rejoinder at the tip of our tongue, right? And we go home feeling like the butt of the joke, and later that night, or a month later, or years later, if we're particularly neurotically writerly about the whole thing, we come up with the line we should have said.
Right.
And that's a moment of revision. We're rewriting that moment. And I think that's often a wish fulfillment starting point for all writers in various ways. And it suggests that sense in which we want to remake experience and remake life, I think, in various ways.
Right. L'esprit de l'escalier, I think.
Exactly. Yeah. The French, of course, have the best term for it, I think.
Right.
I'm talking about l'esprit to the schoolyard, I think is the way I might think about that.
Okay. So I want to first, to begin, let's talk about the bad rap that revision gets. So, you talk about how your students think it's uncool. It's their phrase. There's certainly this kind of auto writing, first thought, best thought. What you say first is the most genuine thing. I mean, this is something I totally disagree with, but it's out there, and I think maybe one of the great mythologized tales of the anti-revision school is, of course, Jack Kerouac writing on his huge scroll and kind of hopped up on all kinds of drugs. He, in 3 weeks on a giant scroll of paper, wrote On the Road. And of course, even that is just totally apocryphal, because then he later on intensively revised it and so on and so forth. But I think it survives as a myth because there's an aspect, I mean, people, I think, first, are somewhat lazy. And second, there is this kind of mystique around, well, art, in so much of life, one has to be rigorous and thoughtful and careful. But art is a space where one is spontaneous and wild and free and so on and so forth. So I'm just opening the door here to you to talk about the bad rap that revision gets and why.
Yeah, no, I really like that. I mean, the Kerouac Scroll is a kind of totemic object. I think, my son is in his teens now, and he's been dragged around various museums by me over the years. And I think he's seen it at 3 different museums, right? It tours the world. We've seen it in London, Paris. I think I've seen it in Chicago as well. So it really does crop up. It feels like it's a really iconic object in writerly museums or writerly displays. And it does, I guess, turn out that you can type very fast when you're on Benzedrine, right? So you can really crank out that draft along the way. But I do think it disguises something. But I think, you're talking about people being lazy, and I would argue that many of us as writers are lazy, right? Our whole mythology of talent in many ways is that it allows you to go faster with less effort, right? Talent feels like it's going to go faster juice in a certain sense, right? And I think all of us as writers are drawn to that. We are ourselves, I think, seduced by that myth, I think, in many ways. So it's one of the things that draws us to writing in the first place. So that's part of the appeal, I think, of that. We wish we were Kerouac. I think Kerouac, to some degree, by claiming that he wrote it in 3 weeks, even though he knows he's gone through the revisions, I think he said that on TV, is sort of leaning into that myth, that wish fulfillment of being a writer, I think, that most of us are seduced by. And I think there is also probably that feeling that the first draft, the first thought, is the authentic one as well in various ways. And yet, as I'm possibly demonstrating right now, I always feel that I would not have become a writer if I was any good live, right? The instinct to be a writer is to rewrite, to make that line better, right? It's again that sense of revisiting and rewriting and remaking that schoolyard moment where we are tongue-tied in our minds after the words. We kind of come up with the better rejoinder, I think, in some ways. So writers are not often great in that first draft. We're not often great in an ad hoc, off-the-cuff kind of way. So we often like to think into things on the page, hence the way that revision can often redeem our clunkiness and our awkwardnesses in first drafts along the way. I do talk a little bit in the book about a great study I read years ago, conducted by a couple of social scientists at Harvard, I think at Berkeley, and they were talking about this hypothesis that the first is the best. There is a human tendency to privilege the first thing we encounter over the second thing in any series. And they do it with, I think with some of the experimental subjects, they did it by giving people 2 sticks of gum and asking them to tell which one they preferred. And I think 60 or 70% of the time, people pick the first gum, even though they're actually very similar. You can reverse the gums, and the experiment still turns out exactly the same way. And I like the gum example because, it's hard to say any piece of gum is particularly inspired or any piece of gum is more authentic than another. So it suggests a kind of human propensity, I think, to the first is best kind of hypothesis. But the great lesson for them, and it's funny you were mentioning George Saunders's couple of prerequisites for a writer. When I hear that question, the one thing that I really think into that I think is great for revision is patience, right? It's that line of Flaubert's, talent is long patience. And I think when they give people longer to make that answer about which gum they prefer, the percentage is heavily biased in favor of the first gum if people are asked to make a decision quickly. With time and with patience, those percentages tend to even out a little bit more as well. And it suggests something of the value of patience for the revision process.
Right. I want to talk about 2 of my favorite writing metaphors. One is one that it belongs to Stephen King, and one is yours that I first encountered in this book. So the Stephen King one is, I have to say, as a connoisseur of metaphors myself, I have found this to be the most durable metaphor, the one that I return to most. And it is, I'm sure you've heard it before, the idea that writing a story is like uncovering a fossil under the earth. And this, he wrote about this in his famous book on writing. And I love it because, so first of all, it's about, you're just digging around and trying to find how this whole thing, what these kind of subconscious structure of this is. You're digging around below the surface of your mind in all your first drafts. And sometimes you dig a little over here, but you don't really find anything. Sometimes you dig over here and you're like, oh, this thing has a giant tail. I never knew about that. And then to further the metaphor, sometimes you dig and you'll find another fossil, and then you'll think, does that belong to this bigger thing I'm doing? Or is it just a fossil on its own that belongs somewhere else to a different creature and so on? I just find the metaphor so rich. And certainly it's a lot that you talk about in your work is about the morale that is necessary for revision. And I think having the right metaphor is also central to keeping morale. And I often find, especially the part of writing that I dislike the most is the first draft, because it's so scattershot and so much of it is going to end up on the cutting room floor. But if you think of yourself as that archaeologist digging around, trying to find this big thing, it helps me be a little bit more patient. And so have you heard that metaphor before? And do you believe?
I have, and I really dig that one. But I think the note you're thinking into there, that feeling of one of the ways we sustain our patience for the whole writing process is by trying to manage our morale, to not get too down as we often are when we're in the middle of this experience. Yeah. And I think one of the ways we think into that morale, and I think the power of those metaphors, is also hearing that somebody else has experienced that and has rationalized it and thought through it. So I'm a big believer. In fact, I taught a class with this very title a semester ago to my graduate students, that misery loves company for a writer. It's actually really sustaining to know that other people have gone through some of those same anxieties and uncertainties along the way and have come through it, not necessarily with the sense that I can always do it more easily next time, but with the wisdom that says, I know it's a little bit of a slog and I know I have to have patience, and also to take what I find and to make something of what I find along the way.
Absolutely. And I want to now talk about a writing metaphor that I hadn't heard before, but which really appealed to me, which you wrote in this work, which is that, you talk about revision and you're talking about in the context of it's something people dread and people think it's such a pain in the ass and like, why would I want to revise? I'm a great artist like Jack Kerouac, blah, blah, blah. And then you say to these people, it sounds like the ask to make a revision is like the ask of like your mother or father asking you to clean up your room. And like, who wants to clean up their room? And it's just such a pain. But then you say, imagine if what they were saying is you're cleaning up your room, but there is a treasure hidden somewhere in this mess. And that is why you're cleaning your room, not just to straighten it, but to find this buried treasure. I thought that really worked for me.
Oh, I really appreciate that. It is true that, when it's mostly my undergraduates who I think, even very talented ones, find the revision process, particularly if you're made to do it, which is a dangerous thing, right? In the space that I'm in with it as a teacher, when you make somebody do it, it feels like a chore, and so it feels as though there's the difficulty of that being not quite in the spirit of discovery, right, and adventure and inspiration. And that's why it feels like more I'm saying tidy your room. I think possibly in some iterations of that metaphor, when I mentioned that you might find some treasure buried beneath that pile of old T-shirts and that laundry that you haven't put away in various ways. I used to say you might find a $20 bill, but I think in other instances I might have said you might find a loose joint. And I'm not sure if that's a useful way of extending. Maybe Kerouac would have revised more if I'd said that. I don't know.
A vial of Benzedrine.
Yeah, I tend not to say that in the classroom, I stress. But that might be a way of thinking of that space. The idea, though, of tidying is it feels like there's a known outcome. Things will be put away, the carpet will be cleared, maybe I'll vacuum, but it feels as though I'm not going to be surprised. I'm only going to end up at a place that I fully expect to end up in. And I think revision is always about our willingness and our excitement and our interest in showing up in a place that might not be the place we thought we were going to get to uncovering something, which goes a little bit to that fossil idea as well.
Right. I love that, a spirit of discovery and a spirit of adventure. Those are just great words for it. And it's my lived experience as well, that is revision is just the most generative part of the process, in fact. So I want to talk about a couple ways that people get revision wrong, and to kind of like typical ways that you point out how people get revisions wrong. So one is this kind of all or nothing, right? That you say that, students of yours in particular, you're talking about students, but I've seen this as well with, published writers. There's this way that they either say like, oh, I begrudgingly will make a few edits like to the prose and, just so I can say I revised and get you off my back. And then there's on the other end of the spectrum, people who get some revision and then they think, well, oh God, the whole thing is terrible. I'm just going to start from scratch. And so could you kind of articulate what the middle sweet spot is between them? What is the right reaction to some revision notes?
Right. Well, so, and I should say, I have enshrined both of those responses in myself, right? I think all of us swing from like the arrogance of, I don't need to change a word and I'll only do it begrudgingly to keep you guys happy, to the kind of abjection of, oh my God, this is all terrible. I want to start again. One of the reasons I want to resist that second notion is, oh, it's so bad, I will throw it all away. I won't really revise. I'm just going to start over again. Is because I feel as though often for writers, and I sometimes see this amongst students I work with over a period of time, there's what I think of as a kind of Groundhog Day style of revision, where you write a story, it's maybe interested in some themes or issues, or maybe a kind of character dynamic that's played out in that draft. You're so unhappy with that draft, you say, I'm going to throw all of that away. I'm going to start another story. But lo and behold, that second story might have some echoes of that first. Maybe some of the thematic space is being reworked. Maybe some of the same character dynamic is being revisited. It may not look the same. It may be set in a completely different place. Maybe it's in space. Maybe it's in the past. Who knows? But there'll be something carried forward. You'll write that draft, also be dissatisfied with that, throw that one away, come up with a third story, again, feeling like it's an independent story, but it will revisit some of the same spaces. And that feels like a feedback loop that we can never quite escape, right? Almost a vicious circle in various ways. So there's an argument to say we have to stand our ground in a strange way, right? We have to make a story try and work even from these very humble, very rough, very problematic beginnings, if only we want to work our way through that material successfully eventually in certain ways. So I'm often interested in that kind of patience, that kind of faith, I suppose, in the work in some ways as well, but also about sustaining our morale as we move through that space. As for the other, I was joking the other day that even when I get feedback from my editors, or indeed from my wife, who's also a very accomplished editor, what I notice in myself, and what my wife helpfully has pointed out to me, is that I always sort of fly into a momentary rage where I go, how could you say this? How could you say that? And what she points out to me is that usually I'm angry about 5% of the feedback that I get, and the other 95% of it is enormously useful to me as well. So some part of that resistance needs to be targeted. And I think it's always smart to be willing to reject certain things that a critic says. We have to maintain that independence to sort of filter out some of those things. But having allowed oneself to do that, we recognize it's not an all or nothing. Let's make the most of the feedback that I can get, what's useful here, what's actionable. What I think, though, I often try and talk folks through, and I think we all feel this, is if we get feedback from others, especially, And probably both of those responses I'm describing amongst my undergraduates represent different ways of responding to the same feeling, that there's just so much that people are telling me, right? A good workshop will generate a lot of feedback. And so we feel, I think, often overwhelmed with that. That's why people feel like, I can't make this any better, I've got to start over, right? And also why people are like, I've got to reject nearly all of it and only take a few things on board. We're trying to sort of filter that overwhelmed quality. And so I think that tends to make the start of a revision post workshop or post a lot of feedback, there's a kind of high tariff, there's a barter. We often get stuck in that space. And in fact, I often encourage students to take a stab at revision, even within a couple of weeks of workshop. And not to say you're going to make the story perfect, you're going to fix everything, just get into it, take the next step, repossess your own story. And the two steps that I suggest for that are really basic ones. It's not to follow the chores that have been set to you. It's not to follow the punch list the workshop has assigned to you. It's to pick, first of all the easy things you can fix. The things where you hear somebody saying, oh yeah, shit, I meant to do that before I gave the story out. I knew that, I forgot to do it, but I can see exactly how to fix it. Do that. That's a great way of building morale, right? We work our way back through the story.
Sure.
We move it forward a little bit incrementally. We repossess it for ourselves because we've just moved it past the draft that everybody else has seen. But after that, what I say is, do the stuff that seems like it's exciting to you and fun to you. Not the thing that you feel like you ought to do or you have to do. That's the part that feels like a chore, but lean into that excitement. So if there's somebody said, oh, I was curious about that secondary character who doesn't do very much work, and you suddenly go, oh, yeah, I can imagine something for that guy, a backstory for him. He could have this line. He could show up again in that scene. What might he do if he did a little bit more work? If that feels like it sparks creativity, the intuition of that is it'll be fun. So let's make the revision process a little bit more exciting and fun, I think. But also that intuition probably suggests there's a discovery to be made there. So that's the thing to lean into, I think, along the way.
Wonderful. Yeah. So two things quickly of what you just said. So that was all wonderful. But one thing that really struck me was this notion that it's only 5% of the editorial feedback that truly bothers you. And I just find that is so true that, you get, I just went through a massive revision with my agent on a work of mine, and a very long work. And you find that you are like particularly wounded by like one or two small comments, and who knows why, and we don't have to unpack that here because I think there can be a variety of reasons, but it's just interesting because like those edits are not in any way the most consequential or the most labor intensive edits, but for some reason a writer will be sensitive about a certain aspect of their work, and then when somebody calls them out on it, they'll fixate on it and it becomes disproportional.
Yeah.
So that really resonated with me.
Yeah, I wonder if it speaks sometimes to that idea of that idea that sometimes comes from revision conversations about killing your darlings, right? That we have these soft spots, these sweet spots, that if somebody picks at them, maybe what's being uncovered is our own lurking anxiety about that space as well. So it's one of the reasons we resist some of that space.
Yep. And then just one other thing I wanted to tell you, so this is how I think of revision sometimes. I'm just kind of curious what your feedback is. So the way I try to do it is I try to think of myself as in this following scenario, that I write my draft and then I turn it in, just I set it aside. Then when I go back to it, I imagine myself like in a Hollywood studio, and the director or the showrunner is like, hey, Mark, here's like the script. We fired the old guy. Okay, but here's the script, and I want you to like make the most of this, right? And you can do whatever you want. Just keep what works, get rid of what doesn't. That old guy just couldn't get it done, but we think you can get this done. And I mean, it's pretty clear to see like what the technique is there. It's kind of defamiliarizing myself with the work, divorcing myself with any attachment to it, and just be like, hey, this is just some raw material that I have the opportunity to make into something that works.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense to me. It's funny actually, because what you're sort of doing in that sense is, we were talking before about the idea of revision by another hand, or we're talking about an adaptation or a movie or a book or vice versa, and it feels that there you've imaginatively entered the mode of the person who's the reviser by another hand, right? The second hand coming to that space. But in a way, I think that's always what's happening in revision, right? We are always saying, I'm now approaching the work of the old me, right? Often one of the ways we get that distance is by putting the work in a drawer for 6 months, right? I think it's a fairly slow process, but you could be sure that by the time you return to it after that period of time, you will be a different writer. Yes. And also B, you will have forgotten what some of that stuff meant back then. So in a strange way, part of the transition, I think, is going from being the writer who thinks he's in control of that first draft to rereading it and sort of seeing it through the eyes of the person who's reading it for the first time and trying to think out, why did those choices get made? Not, I think I know already why, but I'm trying to parse those out as a reader. And in a way, I think that's what happens whenever people hand out anything to an editor or a reader in workshop, even before you've heard feedback, because we're anticipating it. Even I think sometimes when you let them hit send on the manuscript, immediately afterwards, you have, oh shit, I meant to fix that, right? There's that feeling. And it's because we've intuited the other eyes on it, and suddenly we're seeing it with the eyes of a reader. And so actually, literally, revision is about new eyes, re-seeing it through the eyes of another. I think that's the fundamental way of thinking into this space.
Great. All right, folks. So we have about 15 minutes left, and I already see we have some great comments and questions that we'll get to at the end, maybe in about 8 minutes or so. But a few things I want to get to before then. So one of the biggest and most vexing questions for any writer is, how do I know when I'm done? And you dedicate a lot of time, rightly so, in the book to trying to figure out this question. And so just to give you a few kind of ways that other people think about this, I have a good friend who's a published author who says, and I found this really useful to think about over time. She says, when I can no longer tell if I'm making the manuscript better or worse, that's when it's time to give up. There's a sort of another comment that you quote along the same lines in the book that you quote some writers saying, basically, they know they're done when I go through and take all the commas out, when I go back through again and put them back in the same places. So that's, you're done at that point. And then you had a great quote in there of your own. You say you're done at the point at which the opinions of others no longer burden you. But anyway, I'm just opening the floor again to you to say, how do you answer this question when you're truly done? And effectively what that means is, when am I ready to query an agent? When am I ready to give it to my editor? When is it go time?
Well, I'd argue that there are different stages for that. So I often think that when people want to send work out to an agent or share it with an editor, because there will be feedback, you maybe want it to be as good as you can make it at that moment, but not necessarily think that it is 100% done, because that's the resistance point when you get feedback and that people ask for changes along the way. So I think realistically speaking, when it goes to an agent, when it goes to an editor, in the very best circumstances, it might be 95% done, but it's maybe not quite fully there. There's a little room still for editorial feedback and the revision that comes out of that space. But I think the question of doneness is so essential, because the sheer burden of revision, one of the things that puts us off it, I think, is the endlessness, apparently, possibility of it, right? It feels exhausting, because it feels like it may never end. We can always be changing the punctuation, putting a word in here or a word in there. And I suppose for me, the movement is to step away from the vision of revision as an aspect of perfection or polishing, right? It's not about getting every word exactly optimally right, every bit of punctuation exactly optimally right. For me, it's a slightly more fundamental question. I know when I'm done with a story when I finally understand why I wrote it in the first place, which means that the whole trajectory of revision for me is about understanding why I'm writing this, why I'm writing it this way, why the character is doing these things. It's about knowing more. It's one of the reasons I define sort of progress in revision as not necessarily progress towards a finished, polished product, but that sense of, today I knew more about my character, today I knew more about my story than I did yesterday. That's progress that sustains one through this whole process. So it feels, as a writer, that I'm on a journey with my own story. And when I finally get to that point of understanding it, that journey is just about done. I may tweak it a little bit for the sake of the reader to help them come to that understanding with me. But it feels to me as though that's the emotional journey that I'm interested in. And that's why, if it has really arrived at that place of doneness, the judgment of others is less important, I think, to me, because I feel like, yes, this is a conversation between me and the work, and that place of arrival feels like I've been satisfied just in the writing of it, I think, in certain ways.
Indeed, and you're very eloquent in the book on this, and you open the book with a story of an act of heroism of your father, and you talk through the book about the different ways that you have written and rewritten and kind of revised over the course of 4 decades that story. And I think you say, at least now, you claim to have gotten to the point where you know what you want to say, but who knows, in 20 years from now, I'll be talking to you again, and you'll say, well, oh, but now I really, really understand. But I guess my question to you back on that is, I found this a very interesting insight in the book. And you say, the finish point is when the story knows itself, which is a version of what you've just been saying now. But I guess what I want to ask you, just in case it's unclear to anybody what you're about with that comment, give me an example. Like, how would you articulate, oh, I know what the story of my father is, or whatever novel I wrote, because now, like, how does that sound to you? Would you say something to yourself along the lines of, oh, I finally realized that story is about reconciliation between fathers and sons, or what have you? How does that actually take shape?
Well, so a couple of examples about that. I have an early short story. This is probably one of the first places that I intuited this. It's called The Silver Screen. It's in my first collection of stories. It's set out in Malaysia, where my mother's from, during what's sometimes known as the Malayan Emergency. There was a communist uprising. This is a little pre the Vietnam era, and the British colonial forces are sort of struggling and grappling with that communist insurgency. And I have characters who work at a local movie house, and they're the guys who paint the local posters for movies, right? And so they paint John Wayne's face for the latest release of the movie on a huge poster, but they do it replacing his face with sort of Asian faces, right? Because it's just the local way of selling the movie. And so I realized I had a lot going on in this space about these huge 30-foot high faces on a big canvas. There are moments in the narrative where people are beheaded or see beheadings taking place. And I wondered about why this set of imagery in the context of the text. And I think overall, as I came towards the closure of the narrative, I began to understand that some of this had to do with the way I was channeling into almost a pun, the idea of the Asian concept of face being played out in these different ways. And so you feel like the imagery is speaking to something thematic in that space. But as a writer, I wasn't conscious, I wasn't fully aware of it as I worked through multiple drafts. But by the time I came to the end of it, I felt like, oh, now as the reader of that work, I'm understanding why that is taking place in certain ways. And this doesn't happen, I should say, with every single story that I write, but it's happened enough times for that to feel like the thing that drives me forward to revision. That's ultimately what I'm looking for in various ways.
Wonderful. How satisfying too when you ultimately know what you wrote a story for. Folks, the way that Peter Ho Davies came onto my literary landscape is through a keynote address that he gave at Grub Street back in 2018. It was a terrific, kind of charming, funny, insightful, kind of everything that Peter is known for talk, and it was called, I'm going to get this right, Cultural Appropriation, no, or #appropro. So if that gives you an idea of like the tone of this this talk, but it is a great talk. And so, Peter, I want to just mention that because an aspect of revision, which is just inescapable today, is the questions around cultural sensitivity and cultural appropriation. We live in an increasingly diverse world. It's only getting more diverse as the days go by. You cannot, dare I say, really honestly write any story that doesn't have an aspect of diversity and race in it. I mean, this is our daily life now, and I think it's an issue that is very hot politically. It's something a lot of writers are worried about, and so one way that this plays out is, maybe you sell your book, or you're about to go and put it on sub, and you think, well, the last thing I want to do is get a sensitivity reader to look at this and just tell me, am I crossing any lines consciously or unconsciously? But I guess the question I have to you is just, where are we at today with sensitivity readers and with cultural appropriation, insofar as it pertains to how a book gets revised?
That's a really good question. I mean, as I said in that talk those few years ago, the way I think about writing into other spaces is always out of a position on the writer's part of humility. I don't know this, right? So, one of the things I'm even talking about in the revision book is to try and get away from the write what you know idea, which presupposes that we know it and then we write it, which suggests the writer is coming from a place of authority. I often feel like we write it to know it. I'm trying to learn about the world through my writing in various ways. And that humility says and suggests, even through the revision process, we should be open to input and ways that our suggestions or our ideas might be changed or modified in various ways. So the idea of having a sensitivity reader seems something that we might well embrace, but that doesn't mean we have to always accept everything that the sensitivity reader offers up to us. That still has to be the purview of the writer, it seems to me, as well. But for all that we struggle with and we feel a certain pain, and maybe we feel a certain pain, particularly as we get closer and closer to a finished draft, about hearing new takes upon the work that might oblige us to change it, I do think that's a really important thing to be open to in the revision process, that we have to somehow embrace complication or changes, not necessarily as pushing us away from a finished product, but as opportunities to take that complication and turn it into complexity and density and richness in the work. So all these things serve to make the work better ultimately. And I think, again, patience comes in much to our advantage in these regards.
Yeah, and I just again want to stress what I keep hearing from you, which I think is just such a good thing to remember, which is that revision is not a quest for kind of superficial grammatical changes. It is a quest for richness. It is I mean, we're really trying to deepen the art and make it more worthy, and that is what the attitude should be.
Yeah.
Okay, so folks, we're going to do questions from the audience, but first, I have a lightning round, which I'm going to spring upon Peter with no warning.
Right.
Yes, no chance for revision now, Peter. So I'm going to do.
This is my worst nightmare right here.
So I'm going to do like 5 or 6 questions here, and you just have to fill in the blank. Okay. So here we go. First thought, best thought. Remember, that's what we've been talking about. Okay. You need to listen to someone's feedback about your work when
you are afraid of it.
See, this is going to be great. Okay. It's safe to ignore someone's feedback about your work when
you've already tried that.
Good. Okay. The best way to keep morale high during revision is to remember.
I was going to say to have some bacon for lunch, because that's always the way I keep my morale going along the way, I think.
I'll take that. Remember to have bacon for lunch. Got it. Okay.
Give me turkey bacon, anything that's healthy, comfort food. That's what I'm saying, people. Comfort food.
Okay. So 2 more of these. The thing that even you, Peter Ho Davies, still gets wrong about revision is.
Well, I always get the grammar wrong and the spelling wrong. That's why I live with the grammar lady in part, and she helps me fix all of that stuff. It's probably British idiom as well. I'm going to always claim it's the British idiom and the British spelling. That is my defense. It's mostly bullshit.
Oh my gosh. Okay, last one. The reason writers ought to look forward to the revision process is because that is the moment when.
Not only by knowing your work better does it provide rewards, but you know yourself better as a writer, right? That's the moment. It's like looking into yourself, and that surprise and that revelation. I think that's profound and joyous, actually, very often.
Beautiful. Wonderful.
Those weren't really one-word answers to those questions.
That far surpassed my expectation. Maybe first thought, best thought is the key. So anyway, let's put some audience questions up on the screen. We have a few minutes left for these. Sure. Okay, Trisha. Okay, this I think is more of just a comment, but Trisha, thank you for this comment, Trisha. I like to think of the first draft as black and white sketch, then revision turns it into a full color, vibrant painting. Yeah. Peter, what say you?
Oh, I really like that too. I mean, one of the things I often talk about is there can be a tendency to feel like revision should be about editing, should be about cutting, right? Take out the stuff that doesn't work, slim it down, tighten it up. And there is obviously a place for that. But I think revision is not the same always as editing. That for me, there's a real phase, often in the second or third or fourth revisions, where the story has to expand a little bit. So I'm really interested in revision is a process where a manuscript might breathe out and then breathe in, and maybe go through a few iterations of that just to prove that it's alive, I think, in some ways.
Excellent. All right, let's have another question. I found that my plots, thank you, Grant, for leaving this. I found that my plots specifically would completely unravel in the revision process and the story would come apart. Is that just part of the process, or is there a cure for that, or do you just have to push through?
Well, I think it is part of the process, right? One of the horrible things about revision, one of the daunting things, is that feeling that we're often caught up in this circle of taking one step forward and seemingly taking 2 steps back at the same time, right? But I do think we have to be wedded to this idea that a draft or a revision that might fix a problem, but at the same time reveal a couple of new ones, those problems are also possibilities, right? And that every draft is successful if it suggests the need for a further draft, right? We tend to think about a draft that suggests that I need to do further work as being unsuccessful. I would argue that that's just another way of taking us further towards our ultimate goal.
Wonderful. Great. Let's have maybe 1 or 2 questions, one or two more. Audience question. People always talk about killing your darlings. How do you know what a darling is?
That's a great question, actually. How do we know what a darling? I think we just feel it, right? It's something that we love. It's that point where we go, this is the last thing I'll cut because this is the thing that I will hang my hat on. I know this is good. That's how you know it's a darling. And that's probably why you're going to protect it till the very end. You know, my theory is always, I'm not a big fan of the idea of killing our darlings, but I'm a big fan of saving them, maybe putting them on a lifeboat, maybe sending them out to sea so they can start another colony, start another story going in various ways, right? So darlings, I think, can be salvaged. You know, when I think of revisionary metaphors, one of the ones that I really like for myself and tell myself regularly is that I imagine the entirety of my writing output as this vast jigsaw that I'm working upon. And we all know when we're working on a jigsaw, we might pick up a piece, it's blue, it must be there in the sky. We try and jam it in the corner that we're working on and we realize how it doesn't fit. But we don't throw that piece away. We don't burn it. We don't go, that's never going to come in useful. We hang on to it because we know it'll find a place somewhere else in the puzzle. And so that piece is the darling. I'm jamming it again into the story I'm working on now. I may have to take it out. I'm not going to throw it away. I'm just going to save it until it finds its rightful home in another part of the entirety of the work that I'm engaged in. And that's happened to me enough times for me to have faith in that notion.
I mean, it's the metaphors are sort of overlapping here, but that's also how I think about it with the fossil metaphor. It's like, you know, we've just excavated this whole site and we found this really cool other thing. And I really want it to be part of the Tyrannosaurus Rex that I'm showing you because it's so cool. But at the end of the day, it's just not organically part of that. But it is cool. We're not denying that. Just find what it belongs to, you know? It's basically saying the same thing. Anyway, all right. Well, look, we are going to wrap now. I have one final question for you of my own. And this is a question I ask to all writers who come on the show. And it is as follows. Imagine that you have an ideal reader for this book. I mean, this is just the person who is in the exact place in their life, the exact place in their process where they're ready to hear what you have to say. And they get all the references and they love your tone. Everything is working for this reader. Now, just imagine this reader finishes your book, closes it, and just describe for me in a word or a phrase, how does this reader feel at that moment?
The ideal reader for this particular revision book is me about 25 years ago, right? Struggling with the concepts of revision and where you go and how you move a piece forward. And the feeling I think I'd like that reader to have, and I hope readers reading it today who are writers and struggling with the same anxieties, is hope, right? That this is a process that actually leads somewhere good as long as we have some faith in this process.
I love it. I love hope. I love to end on a note of hope. Peter, thank you so much. And I just want to say, you know, every time I hear you talk, I feel soothed. I feel soothed. I mean, no matter you're giving a keynote, you're doing a radio interview, what have you, every single time I see you, and I've had the same experience today. After talking with you or hearing you talk, I feel everything's going to be okay. So
at least with our writing, I can't speak to the rest of it, but maybe with our writing, you know, because I think anxiety gets in the way of good work, right? Yeah. And so if we can try and think through these challenges and problems, that's a route towards good work.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, folks. So here's the book again. It's called The Art of Revision, The Last Word by Peter Ho Davies. Please go ahead and buy it. There's a bunch of links in the chat. You can go and buy it right now, make an impulse buy or 5. Peter, thank you so much. It's been such an honor to have you on the show.
Mark, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure having this conversation. Appreciate all the questions as well.
Of course. I love the book. Folks, we'll be on next week with Jenna Blum for her launch of her book, Woodrow on the Bench, and we will see you then.